The crack had always been there. It ran vertical through the limestone face of Bone Ridge like a wound that had never healed. 3 feet tall, 18 inches wide. And on cold mornings when the air of Harlan County fell silent and the frost pressed down on the Kentucky hills, the crack exhaled. A slow, steady breath of warm air rising out of the rock like something alive down there was still dreaming. Hunters passed it, loggers passed it. Children threw stones into it and listened to them clatter into silence. Nobody crawled in. It was too narrow, too dark, too much like a mouth. Orla Thorne crawled in on the 11th of November, 1848. She was 37 years old, the youngest of 4 siblings and the only daughter, and she had been given nothing. That morning, with the gray light of a dying autumn spread thin across the ridge, Orla pressed her shoulder against the cold stone and turned sideways. The limestone scraped her coat. The air inside the crack met the air outside, and between the two, her breath clouded and vanished. She held the lantern out in front of her. She pushed in. The first 10 feet were the worst. The stone closed around her like a vice, pressing her chest and her back at the same time, and every breath became a small act of war. Her ribs had to push the rock to make room for her lungs. The rough limestone scraped her shirt, then the skin beneath it. She could not turn her head. She could not raise her arm. She could only see what the lantern showed her, and what the lantern showed her was more rock, more narrow passage, more dark ahead. But she kept moving, because a woman who has been given nothing has nothing left to lose. 2 weeks before, in the front parlor of the Thorne farmhouse, a lawyer from the settlement had read the last will and testament of Amos Thorne in a voice like the scrape of a dull plow over frozen ground. The room had smelled of wood smoke and old tobacco. Amos had been in the cold earth for a month. His 3 sons and his only daughter sat in a half circle on mismatched chairs, each of them waiting to learn what the dead man had thought of them. Josiah Thorne sat in the best chair. 46 years old, heavy as a draft horse, with the thick hands of a man who measured the world in acres and bushels. He was the eldest, and he wore the expectation of inheritance on his face the way another man might wear a good hat. Beside him sat Ephraim, the second son, lean and quick-eyed, a timberman who had run the family sawmill for 15 years. And beside Ephraim sat Elias, the third son, the quiet one who looked at the floor and said nothing, and had said nothing for most of his life. And in the corner, almost out of sight of the lawyer, sat Orla. She was small compared to her brothers, 5'5", narrow-shouldered, wiry. She had the look of a woman who had read too many books and done too little of what a woman was supposed to do, and her hands, though not soft, were not the hands of a farm wife. Her brothers had always called her Orla when they were being kind, and Runt when they were not. They had not been kind very often. The lawyer cleared his throat. He read out the farm, 260 acres of good bottomland, the main house, the barn, the smokehouse, the orchards, the tools, the grain stored against winter. To Josiah, Josiah nodded slow and satisfied, as if the reading had merely confirmed what God had already decided. The lawyer read out the timber rights, the sawmill, the stand of virgin hardwood on the south slope, black walnut and white oak, the kind of timber that built the fortunes of men who knew how to turn a tree into a dollar. To Ephraim allowed himself a small, sharp smile. The lawyer read out the south pasture, the livestock, 40 head of cattle, a dozen hogs, the mules, the chickens, the milk cow that had been old Amos's pride. To Elias. Elias did not smile. He did not nod. He only looked at the floor, and his mouth tightened once, and then he was still again. The lawyer turned the page, and Orla watched her brothers the way a woman watches a storm she cannot outrun. To my daughter Orla Thorne, the lawyer read, I leave the ridge parcel being 40 acres of rocky and unsuitable ground lying east of the creek and south of the old survey line, together with whatever may be found thereon. The room went quiet. And then Josiah laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had waited a long time to be proven right about his sister and who was enjoying the proving. It filled the parlor the way smoke fills a closed room. Ephraim joined in a dry chuckle, a shake of the head. "You got the bones, girl," Josiah said. He slapped his knee. "Bone ridge, fitting for the runt of the litter." "Ain't even good bones," Ephraim added, wiping his mouth. "Limestone. Can't build with it, can't burn it, can't eat it, but I reckon our Orla can read her books on it." Orla felt something tighten in her chest. It was not anger. Anger would have been easier. It was a cold, quiet recognition, the kind a woman feels when she finally understands that the thing she has been hoping for is not coming. She looked at her oldest brother. Josiah's face was flushed with laughter and triumph, and behind those things something else. Something Orla had seen on that face since she was a girl. Contempt. Plain and simple, the contempt of the strong man for the one who had always seemed less than strong, and the extra contempt, quieter but older, of the brother who had never quite forgiven his sister for being the thing his father had read to in the evenings. Orla looked at Ephraim. Ephraim would not meet her eyes. And then Orla looked at Elias. The quiet brother was still staring at the floor. His arms were folded. His jaw was tight. He had not laughed. He had not said a word. But he had not spoken up either, and in that silence, Orla read a truth she had carried all her life. Even the brother who did not despise her would not defend her. Orla stood up. She did not speak. She took the deed from the lawyer's hand. She walked to the door of the parlor. She opened it. The cold November air came in and met the warm air of the room, and for a moment the wood smoke stirred and curled and looked in the pale light like the breath of the ridge itself. And Orla Thorne, 37 years old, the only daughter of Amos Thorne, walked out of her father's house and did not come back. She had nowhere to go except the ridge, so she went to the ridge. She walked east from the farmhouse with everything she owned on her back, which was not much. A bedroll, a small axe, a good knife, a coil of hemp rope, a tin lantern and a flask of oil, $11 in silver coin folded inside a scrap of cloth, a tin cup, a wool blanket, a pound of parched corn, and 3 books. The first was Sir Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, a used volume she had traded 4 squirrel pelts for at a bookseller in the settlement 3 summers earlier. The second was a battered copy of Silliman's American Journal of Science, given to her by a Presbyterian minister named Whitcomb, who kept a lending library above his parlor and believed, against the prevailing opinion of the county, that a farmer's daughter might be capable of learning. And the third book was her mother's Bible. She did not carry the Bible for devotional reasons. She carried it because her mother's handwriting was in the margins, and her handwriting was the closest thing to her voice that remained in the world. Mary Thorne had died when Orla was 9. She had been a soft-spoken woman with reddish hair and a way of reading to her youngest child in the evenings while the boys roughhoused outside. She had taught her daughter to look at the world and to wonder about it, and she had died of a fever in 3 days in the summer of 1820, and Amos had never quite looked at his only daughter the same way after. Amos Thorne had been a practical man. He had valued practical sons, and his 3 practical sons had grown up to be men he understood. Big-shouldered, slow-spoken, hungry for land. Orla had grown up to be something else. A quiet girl, a question-asking girl, a girl who preferred the lending library to the kitchen, and who once spent an entire Sunday afternoon sitting on a rock by the creek trying to figure out how the water had cut the bend. Amos had found his only daughter in the middle of the thinking and had not known what to say, and in the end, he had said nothing at all. That had been the pattern of their lives. A father who did not know what to say, and a daughter who did not know how to be understood. She had stayed at the farmhouse because there was nowhere else to stay. She had done the women's work because there was no one else to do it. She had read her books late at night when the house was asleep and had kept her mind mostly to herself because she had learned young that what was in it embarrassed her brothers. And now the father was dead, and the daughter was walking up a ridge that nobody wanted toward 40 acres of rock that had been given to her as a joke. She crossed the creek on a fallen hickory, the bark rough and frost-slick under her boots. She climbed through a stand of tulip poplars whose leaves had gone the color of old gold, a soft and ancient gold that felt in the thin November light like the color of something that had been and was leaving. The slope steepened, the soil thinned, the trees gave way to cedar scrub, and then to bare rock, pale gray limestone, fractured and weathered, covered in patches of lichen that were themselves the color of bone. And there she stood at the top of Bone Ridge, with her new inheritance spread out around her. It was a narrow shelf of stone, perhaps 30 feet wide, at its broadest running north and south for half a mile. On either side, the ground dropped steeply away into cedar and deadfall. Below her to the west, she could see the smoke rising from the chimney of the Thorne farmhouse, where her brothers were now dividing the last of their father's tools. Beyond the farmhouse, the creek. Beyond the creek, the rolling patchwork of fields and pastures that made up the Thorne land. And beyond all of that, the blue receding haze of the Cumberland Mountains fading into distance like a memory losing its edges. Orla stood very still. A cold wind moved across the ridge. It smelled of frost and cedar and old stone. Her coat was thin. The silver in her pocket was all the money she had in the world, and she had 40 acres of nothing. She sat down on a flat outcrop and opened her mother's Bible, not to read, just to look at her handwriting. Mary Thorne had underlined a verse in Isaiah, and in the margin she had written in the small, neat hand Orla remembered from childhood letters one word: wait. Orla ran her thumb over the word. Wait. She did not know what her mother had meant. She did not know if Mary had meant anything at all beyond a note to herself on a quiet Sunday 40 years ago. But Orla sat there on the ridge with the word in her hand and the wind moving across the stone and the sun falling low behind the Cumberlands. And for the first time since her father's funeral, she did not feel angry. She felt patient. She closed the Bible. She wrapped it in its oilcloth. She made camp in the lee of the outcrop out of the wind. She built a small fire of cedar deadfall, and she ate a handful of parched corn and drank from her tin cup, and she watched the stars come out over Kentucky, one by one, patient and far and indifferent to the fact that Orla Thorne owned 40 acres of bone. She slept on the rock, and in the morning she began to walk her land. It did not take long. 40 acres of narrow ridge covered a great deal of linear distance, but very little usable ground. Orla walked the length of her inheritance in 2 hours, and she walked it slowly because she was a woman who had learned to see the world the way her mother had taught her to see it, carefully, with patience, with the belief that a thing observed long enough would eventually tell you what it was. The limestone lay in horizontal beds, heavily fractured. There were sinkholes along the ridge, small depressions where the rock had dissolved and collapsed over centuries. The vegetation was sparse. Red cedars clung to the thin soil pockets. A few stunted oaks held their brown leaves against the wind. Clumps of blue stem grass rattled in the shallow places. There were no springs, no flat ground, no timber worth cutting. Her brothers had been right as far as that went. The land was by any ordinary measure useless. But Orla had not come up the ridge expecting ordinary measures. She had come up the ridge because it was all she had, and so she looked more carefully than the ordinary walker would have looked. She walked with her head down, reading the rock. She knelt beside the sinkholes. She ran her palm along the lichen. She noticed as the morning wore on that the limestone was not merely fractured, but was laced with vertical cracks at irregular intervals, some hairline thin, some wide enough to insert a hand, and some of them breathed. She had read about this in Lyle, the phenomenon of cave breathing, the movement of air in and out of underground voids in response to barometric pressure and to the difference in temperature between the surface and the deep earth. A breathing crack meant a void below. A void meant a passage, and in limestone country, a passage could mean anything. She stopped at the first breathing crack. She found a small fissure no wider than her hand, and she held her palm in front of it and felt the air. It was cold compared to the November air. It was not cold compared to the inside of a living thing. Warm, in fact, to a woman whose hands were nearly numb. She estimated from what she had read that the cave air maintained a steady temperature year-round, insulated from the seasons. In summer, it would feel cool. In winter, it would feel warm. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she kept walking. She found larger cracks, one she could almost fit her forearm into, another that exhaled so steadily that the grass in front of it moved as if someone were breathing on it. She followed the east face of the ridge, marking each fissure in her small, leather-bound notebook, and after another hour of walking, she came to the crack. It was different from the others, not just in size, but in feeling. It was 3 feet tall and roughly 18 inches wide, a vertical wound in a small bluff of limestone about halfway down the eastern slope. The rock around it was pale and weathered. The ground at its base was bare of grass, scuffed by the passage of animals over centuries. And the air that came out of it was not a thin breath, but a steady, persistent flow, a column of warm, clean air that Orla could feel against her face from 3 feet away. She knelt. She held her lantern unlit in front of the fissure. The air moved the flame wick even without a flame. She closed her eyes. She smelled wet mineral and deep thyme. She smelled clean stone and still water. She smelled nothing of rot, nothing of sulfur, nothing that suggested anything dead had been down there for a very long time. Good air, moving air, air that had been somewhere and was going somewhere else, and had been doing so in all likelihood since before her grandmother's grandmother had been born. Orla opened her eyes. She looked at the crack. She looked at her own shoulders. She looked back at the crack. It would be tight. She was not a large woman, but 18 inches was not much room. And she had no idea what was on the other side. There might be a few feet of passage and then a solid wall. There might be a shaft dropping into nothing. There might be something worse. She thought of her brothers in the parlor laughing. She thought of her mother's word in the margin. Wait. She thought strangely of her father. Amos Thorne, the practical man who had written into his will a line about whatever may be found thereon. Nobody had explained that line. Nobody had wondered about it. Her brothers had assumed it was a flourish in old man's language. But Orla, kneeling in front of the breathing crack with the cold air of November on her back and the warm air of the earth on her face, wondered for the first time if her father, who had walked these ridges alone for 60 years, had ever heard the crack breathe. She did not know. She would never know. But the question once asked would not be unasked. Orla lit the lantern. She took off her coat because 18 inches was 18 inches and she needed every fraction. She folded the coat and left it on a flat stone beside the crack. She tucked her notebook inside her shirt against the skin. She coiled the rope around her left shoulder. She took a long, slow breath of the cold November air. And then she turned sideways, held the lantern out in front of her with her right hand, and pushed into the crack. The first 10 feet were the worst. The limestone closed around her on both sides. Her left shoulder scraped the rock. Her right shoulder scraped the rock. Every breath became an argument. Her ribs pushed against the stone, and the stone did not push back because the stone did not know she was there. And that indifference was the most frightening thing about it. She was not fighting an enemy. She was fighting the shape of the world. She moved an inch, then another inch. She slid her right foot forward. She shifted her hips. She shifted her shoulders. She slid her left foot up to meet her right. She slid the lantern forward along the stone. She breathed out, compressed her chest, and moved another inch. The rock was rough but not sharp. It did not cut. It only scraped, and the scraping was patient, and after a minute and then two, her shirt beneath the coat had worn thin at the shoulder, and the skin under the shirt had gone hot. At 20 feet, the passage angled slightly downward. The floor, which had been level and gravel, dropped 6 inches. Her boots scuffed on loose stone that had accumulated there over centuries, washed in by surface runoff or carried by the slow crawl of small animals. The walls glistened with condensation. The moisture was cool against her hands when she braced herself. The air grew stronger. It flowed past her now, steady and insistent, the way a river flows past a woman waiting in it. It pulled at the flame of her lantern. It smelled cleaner the deeper she went, as if the air above the ridge had been carrying the dust of the world, and only down here was it washed clean. At 30 feet, the crack narrowed. She felt it before she saw it. Her ribs pressed harder against the stone. Her breath shortened. She stopped moving and looked down. The lantern light showed her a gap that could not have been more than 14 inches wide. Her shoulders, even narrow as they were wider than that. And that was when the fear came. It came up through her like a flood, pure primal bright, the fear of being stuck, the fear of dying in the dark between two walls of stone that did not care whether she lived or died. It filled the narrow space like water fills a vessel, and it left no room for anything else. Her heart hammered against her compressed ribs. Sweat broke on her forehead. The lantern trembled in her hand, and the flame trembled with it, and the shadows on the wall trembled, and for a long moment Orla Thorne was not a woman at all, but a frightened animal in a trap. She closed her eyes. She could not go back. The passage was too narrow to turn around in, and even if she could have turned, the slight downward grade meant she would have had to climb back up through the scraping, compressing distance she had already come. And she did not know in the dark behind closed eyes whether she had the strength for that. She breathed. She counted. 1 breath, 2, 3. She thought about her mother. She thought about her hand in the margin of the Bible. She thought about the word wait. She counted 10 breaths. And then somewhere between the 8th breath and the 9th, the fear passed. It did not go away. It was still there down at the bottom of her, but it lost its grip. She passed through it the way a person passes through a doorway, from one room to another, from one state of being to another. On the other side of the fear was a cold, clear calm that felt like the opposite of everything she had just felt. She opened her eyes. She exhaled everything she had in her lungs. She compressed herself as much as her body would compress. She moved her right foot forward. Her ribs scraped. Her shoulders scraped. She moved 2 inches, then 2 more. She did not breathe. She did not think. She moved, and the stone allowed her to move. And after what might have been 30 seconds or 30 years, the passage widened again, only by an inch. But an inch was enough. She drew a breath. She kept going. At 35 feet, the walls began finally to recede, not dramatically, a foot of space on each side, enough to turn her shoulders, enough to lift her arm. The floor dropped in a natural ramp. She could stand straighter. At 40 feet, the crack ended. Orla Thorne raised her lantern and looked into a room the size of a cathedral. The light did not reach the far wall. It did not reach the ceiling. It did not reach the corners of the chamber, wherever those were. It dissolved outward into darkness, the way a candle dissolves into the night sky, illuminating only the small circle where her body stood. She could see at her feet a floor of pale limestone, smooth as old bone, sloping gently down and away from her. She could see perhaps 20 feet to her left a wall of stone rising vertically into the black. She could see directly ahead of her, nothing at all for a long way, and then very faintly, the suggestion of something that might have been a column or might only have been the edge of her own imagination. She stood in a small ring of light at the edge of an enormous dark, and the dark did not press in on her the way the crack had pressed in. The dark was open. It was vast. It had depth. It had height. It had dimensions so far beyond the reach of her lantern that standing at the edge of it was almost like standing at the edge of the sky. She shouted. Not a word, a single sound, a syllable pushed out of her chest. And the echo came back. Once, twice, 3 times. Each return fainter and farther than the last, each one arriving from a different direction, as if the room were speaking back to her in voices she could not quite place. The shouts faded. The silence returned. It was not the silence of an empty house or a winter field. It was a deeper silence, the silence of a place that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Orla stepped forward. The floor was remarkably even. It was a natural pavement of water-smoothed limestone, dry and solid under her boots. Her footsteps echoed with a quality she had never heard before, a resonance that was not sharp, like footsteps in a church, not flat, like footsteps in a room, but something deeper and sustained, as if the stone itself were vibrating in a low sympathy with every foot that fell upon it. She walked 30 paces. The lantern reached the far wall, but it was not a wall. It was a formation, a great curtain of flowstone 30 feet high, cascading down out of the unseen ceiling in frozen ripples of cream and amber and the palest rose. The light of her lantern passed into the thin places at the edges and lit them from within so that the stone seemed impossibly to glow. It was as if the rock were holding a fire inside itself, a very old and patient fire that had been burning there long before people had learned to make fire at all. Orla's hand shook. The lantern shook with it. The light on the flowstone shook. And for the first time in her adult life, Orla Thorne, the quiet youngest child who had taught herself not to feel things too deeply because feeling had never seemed to help, her felt something rise in her chest that she could not name. She turned slowly. As her eyes adjusted and the light explored the chamber revealed itself in pieces. Stalactites hung from above. She could see them now, their tips catching the light, some slender as icicles, others blunt and thick as the pillars of a church. The ceiling, wherever it was, had to be 40 feet overhead, perhaps more. From the floor, stalagmites rose in cones and columns of every height. Some were knee-high, some were taller than she was, and in several places where the stalactites and the stalagmites had grown toward each other across thousands upon thousands of years, they had met and joined and become complete columns running from the floor to the unseen ceiling, like the pillars of the cathedral the chamber so resembled. Along the walls, the limestone had been sculpted by the slow work of water into formations of a variety that seemed almost impossible. Draperies of stone hung in folds as delicate as cloth. Along the base of one wall, a series of thin walls of calcite, no thicker than a finger, had dammed a flow of water into terraced basins, each one holding a shallow pool of perfectly still water, clear as glass, that reflected the lantern light back up into the stalactites above. In an alcove off to her right, a cluster of strange, twisted tendrils of stone that seemed to defy gravity, curling in spirals and corkscrews, covered the wall like frozen coral. It was beautiful beyond speaking. It had been here, beautiful and unseen, for longer than any human memory could measure. Orla sat down on a flat-topped stalagmite that had been worn smooth by some ancient flow of water. She opened her notebook and she found that her hands were shaking. Not with cold, not with fear, with something else. The simple, overwhelming fact of what she had found. She steadied the pencil against the page. She wrote the date, Sunday the 12th of November, 1848. She wrote that she had entered a crack on the east face of Bone Ridge, and that the crack was approximately 40 feet long and very narrow, and that it opened into a chamber of extraordinary size. She estimated the chamber at 80 feet wide, 100 feet long, with a ceiling of at least 40 feet. She listed the formations she could see: stalactites, stalagmites, flowstone, rimstone dams, helictites. She noted that the temperature was warm. She noted that the air was clean. Then she paused, and then beneath the careful scientific observation and handwriting, slightly different from the careful hand above, she wrote a second line. This is the most remarkable thing I have ever seen. She closed the notebook. She sat on the stalagmite for a long time in the warm, still air of the cathedral chamber, with the lantern burning and the great flowstone curtain glowing softly ahead of her. And she thought about her brothers in the farmhouse dividing the last of their father's tools. She thought about Josiah's laugh. She thought about Ephraim's dry dismissal. She thought about Elias silent in the corner looking at the floor. And she thought about the line in her father's will. Together with whatever may be found thereon, she did not know whether her father had known. She did not know whether he had suspected. She did not know whether the line was nothing at all, a lawyer's turn of phrase, or whether it was something else, a quiet message from a practical man who had never quite learned how to say a kind word to his only daughter. She would never know. But sitting in the cathedral chamber with the lantern on a stalagmite and the great curtain glowing ahead of her, Orla found that the not knowing was for the first time in her life all right. The ridge had given her an answer. The answer was not the one her brothers had assumed. The answer was not the one the world had assumed. The answer was here. It had been here all along. And she, Orla Thorne, the runt, the youngest, the one who had been given nothing, was the only one who had turned sideways and looked. She spent 3 days exploring before she made her decision. She found that the cathedral chamber was only the beginning. Behind the great flowstone curtain, a passage descended steeply for 60 feet and opened into a second room, smaller than the first, but struck through with a different kind of beauty. This room was dominated by a pool, a still clear body of water perhaps 40 feet across, fed by a slow drip from the ceiling that had been falling, she calculated, from what she had read, for tens of thousands of years. The pool's edges were rimmed with calcite that had built up over millennia into a basin of such regularity that it might have been designed by an architect, except that no human hand had ever touched it. Beyond the pool chamber, she crawled through a low passage on her hands and knees for 20 feet and came out into a third room, long and narrow like a hallway. The walls of that room were covered in a dense growth of soda straws, hollow tubes of calcite no thicker than a drinking reed hanging from the ceiling in clusters so tight they looked like the inverted canopy of a crystalline forest. The soda straws were fragile. A single breath could have broken them. Orla moved through that room with a reverence that bordered on fear, terrified that her lantern flame or her clumsy human body would destroy something that had taken centuries to form. She mapped as she went. She had no instruments, only a small compass and her own paced steps, but she mapped carefully, drawing chamber shapes and passage connections in her notebook. The system proved to be extensive. At least a dozen rooms of various sizes connected by passages that range from comfortable walking height to belly crawl squeezes. The total extent she estimated was perhaps a quarter mile, though the twisting and branching made precise measurement impossible. The temperature remained constant everywhere, between 55 and 58 degrees, warm in winter, cool in summer, a thermal constant hidden beneath 40 acres of worthless stone. And somewhere in the middle of the second day, sitting in the cathedral chamber eating a handful of parched corn, while the lantern burned quietly on the stalagmite, Orla realized something. She realized it not as a sudden thought, but as a gradual recognition, the way a person recognizes a face in a crowd. First, a flicker, then a certainty. She had no house. She had no money to build a house. She had 40 acres of ridgeland that could not be farmed or timbered or grazed. But beneath that land, hidden behind a crack that was too narrow for her brothers, too dark for her neighbors, and too strange for any casual traveler, there was a natural shelter of extraordinary quality. Dry, warm, spacious, with good air and clean water. The cathedral chamber alone was larger than any house in Harlan County. She could live here. She sat very still with the thought. The lantern burned. The flowstone glowed. The drip in the pool chamber far behind her kept its patient rhythm. Somewhere in the deeper passages, air moved through stone with a sound like slow, quiet breathing. She could live here. On the 15th of November, 1848, 4 days after she had first crawled through the crack, Orla Thorne moved in. She pushed her bedroll through the narrow passage ahead of her, and then her books, and then her tools, each item a small battle with 18 inches of limestone. She set up her camp near the base of the great flowstone curtain, where a natural alcove in the rock offered a sheltered space about the size of a small room. She spread her bedroll on the smooth floor. She set the lantern on a flat-topped stalagmite. She opened Lyell's Principles of Geology and read for an hour by the light of her own small flame, surrounded by formations that Lyell himself would have marveled at. When she finally blew out the lantern, the darkness that came was absolute. Not the darkness of a cloudy night, not the darkness of a closed room, the darkness of the deep earth. A blackness so total that her eyes could find no difference between open and shut. It was the same darkness that had filled this chamber since the rock had been laid down and the water had carved it out, since the first drop had fallen in the pool chamber and begun its infinitely patient work on the calcite basin. Orla lay in it. She listened to the silence, which was not quite silence. There was the faint drip from the pool chamber. There was the almost imperceptible movement of air through the passages, and beneath everything, deep subsonic hum that she could feel more than hear the vibration of the earth itself, patient and enormous, and utterly indifferent to the woman who had come to live inside it. The stone held her like a hand. She slept. Word reached the settlement, as word always did. A trapper named Zebulon Crowder, following a deer trail along Bone Ridge, on a cold morning in January, noticed smoke rising from a crack in the rock. He was a cautious man. Zeb, a widower who had spent 40 years reading the forest the way other men read books, and he did not like smoke that rose from places where smoke was not supposed to rise. He crept closer. He saw a coat folded on a flat stone. He saw a coil of rope. He saw the print of a boot in the soft frost. He called out. After a long moment, a voice answered from inside the rock. A woman's voice. "Who's there?" Zeb Crowder put his hand on his rifle and took it off again when he heard her. A woman's voice from inside a ridge was not the sort of thing his rifle had ever been of use against. "Zebulon Crowder," he said. "Who in God's name are you?" There was a silence. Then the voice came again, calm as a woman answering her own door. "Orla Thorne, I live here." Zeb did not go in. He went back to town and he told everyone he met that Amos Thorne's daughter had lost her wits and was living inside Bone Ridge like a fox in a burrow. And the story ran through the settlement with the speed that such stories always run, and it ran faster. Perhaps because a woman alone in a cave was the kind of story a small town kept on its tongue longer than a man alone in a cave would have been. By the time it reached Orla's brothers, Orla was eating corn mush for breakfast in the warm stone glow of the cathedral chamber 40 feet below the ground, with the flow stone curtain burning amber in her lantern light. She did not know yet that the story had reached her brothers. She did not know yet that Josiah Thorne up in the farmhouse had set down his coffee cup slowly and said to nobody in particular that something was going to have to be done about the girl. She did not know yet that Josiah Thorne, a week later, would saddle a horse and ride up the ridge to look at the crack for himself, that Josiah would stand there in the February cold with his coat pulled tight and his breath clouding the air, and that he would look down at the footprints in the snow and at the faint plume of warmth rising from the narrow dark, and that his face would change. Slowly, not with contempt, with something else. Something that Orla Thorne, the run of the litter, would learn to recognize in the years to come. The look of a man who had just realized for the first time in his life that he had given away something he did not know he owned. The crack had been 18 inches wide when Orla Thorne first pushed into it. By the middle of December, she had made it 20. It was not much. 2 inches of limestone chiseled patiently from the narrowest point of the passage, the point where her ribs had pressed against stone and her heart had hammered, and the old primal fear had risen up her throat. She could have made it wider. A person with blasting powder could have opened it in a morning. But Orla had no blasting powder, and she had no desire, even if she had had the means to tear open the rock that had kept this place hidden for 10,000 years. She worked with a hammer and a chisel. She worked by the light of her tin lantern. She worked one careful stroke at a time. The sound of it carried. Every strike of the hammer sent a sharp crack echoing down the passage and out into the cathedral beyond, where the echo was caught by the great flowstone curtain and returned to her softer, slower, as if the chamber itself were considering what she was doing and had decided for reasons of its own to allow it. She worked 2 hours each morning and 2 hours each afternoon for 14 days. When she was finished, the narrowest point of the crack had gone from 14 inches to 20, and that was the difference between a passage that left a person breathless and a passage that only left them scraped. She slept on the stone. She ate parched corn and dried venison, and when she could fresh rabbit from the snares, she sat on the ridge above. She drank from the pool in the second chamber water, so clean it had no taste at all, filtered by 100 feet of limestone, and cold as a January creek. She read Lyell's geology for the 3rd time and began to take her own notes in the margins, small careful annotations where she agreed with the Scotsman, and small careful annotations where she did not. She built a sleeping platform of cedar planks raised a foot off the floor to keep her bedding dry. She built a small desk from scavenged wood, wedging it into the alcove near the flowstone curtain, where the amber light of the stone reflected most kindly onto the page. She built shelves for her books. She built hooks along a natural fissure in the wall for drying herbs. Every piece of furniture was built inside the cave because nothing wider than her own shoulders could pass through the crack. And so she built with mortise and tenon joints and oak pegs, no iron, no nails because nails would have required a forge, and a forge would have required ventilation that the narrow passage could not provide. It was slow work. It was the slowest work she had ever done in her life. And it was the first work she had ever done that was entirely her own. She had not planned to be a carpenter. Women in Harlan County did not plan to be carpenters. But she had watched the wheelwright in the settlement at his work when she was a girl, and she had watched her father frame a corn crib, and she had watched her brothers patch the farmhouse roof the summer she was 12, and she had, in the quiet way of a person who is paying attention when no one thinks she has learned a great deal. She discovered now in the cave that her hands knew more than she had given them credit for. She discovered that a mortise cut patiently was as satisfying as a sentence written plainly. She discovered that she had all her life been a builder waiting for something to build. She built. The loneliness was harder than the cold. The cold she could manage. The cave held its temperature steady at 56 degrees warm as an April morning, and she wore a wool shirt and worked until her blood was up and she was fine. The cold was a problem she had solved. The loneliness was not. There were days, particularly in January, when the light above the ridge went gray and thin and the sky pressed down like a lid, and Orla climbed up to the surface to check her snares and found herself standing on the limestone shelf with the whole of Harlan County spread out beneath her, and not one person in it who knew her name in the way a person ought to be known. Not one person who would have missed her if she had fallen on the icy rock and broken her neck. Not one person who would have noticed for weeks, maybe longer, if the smoke simply stopped rising from the crack in the ridge. On those days, she felt the loneliness as a physical thing pressing on her chest the way the stone had pressed during her first passage through the crack. It was not a grief exactly. It was closer to a kind of pressure, the pressure of being in every way that mattered alone. She had learned as a girl how to live with it. The only daughter of a practical man in a hard country does not often get what she needs. But she had always at the edges of that loneliness had the borrowed warmth of a family, however distant. A brother who was not cruel if not kind. A father who spoke if not often. A farmhouse with a fire in it that she could walk into if the cold outside grew too cold. Now there was no farmhouse. There was only the cave. And the cave was warm, and the cave was dry, and the cave held her like a hand. But the cave was also silent, and the silence had no voice to answer her when she spoke. So she worked. Work was the medicine. As long as her hands were moving, building, chiseling, measuring, writing, the loneliness receded to a manageable distance, like a sound that was always present, but could be ignored if a person concentrated on something closer. She learned that first winter that purpose was a stronger medicine than rest. She learned that a woman can survive almost anything if she has a reason to get up in the morning. Her reason was the notebook. It had started as a diary. It had become something else. By the middle of January, Orla had filled the first small leather-bound book and had started the second, and the second was not a diary at all. It was a survey, a systematic, methodical survey of the cave system. She was mapping every chamber. She was measuring every passage. She was cataloging every formation. She was tracing where she could the slow movement of water from the drip in the pool chamber through a series of natural channels toward what she suspected was a spring on the south face of the ridge. She was, in short, doing the work of a scientist. She was a farmer's daughter with a borrowed books and no university behind her, and she knew that full well. She knew that the men who wrote in Silliman's journal would have laughed at her if they had seen her ungainly sketches and her pacing for distance and her compass needle bearings. She knew, too, that they would have laughed twice as hard if they had learned the observations were made by a woman. The scientific men of 1849 did not make much room for women. But the observations were careful and the records were honest, and as the cave emerged in her notebook page by page, chamber by chamber, it became something that no casual visitor could have guessed. It became a place of genuine complexity, and she, Orla Thorne, was the one who understood it. Josiah came up the ridge in the middle of February. It was a hard morning, the kind of Kentucky morning when the sky is so cold and so clear that it looks polished. Orla was splitting kindling outside the crack, a pile of cedar sticks at her feet, her breath clouding in the air when she heard the horse coming up the slope. She did not stop splitting. She set the axe, raised it, brought it down. A stick cracked clean. She set another one. Josiah rode up on a big roan gelding that was breathing hard from the climb. He did not dismount. He sat in the saddle and looked down at his sister, and for a long moment nothing was said. Orla set another stick. She split it. She did not look up. "You need to come down from here," Josiah said. Orla set the axe on the ground. She picked up the split pieces and stacked them against the rock. She still did not look up. "Why, because you're living in a hole." "I'm living in a cave," Orla said. "There's a difference." Josiah shifted in the saddle. The leather creaked. The horse blew out a cloud of warm breath that hung in the cold air and then faded. "People are talking," Josiah said. Orla finally looked at him. Her brother had aged in the 4 months since their father's funeral. There were new lines around his eyes. The heaviness that had always sat on him had settled lower into the jowls. He looked, Orla realized, like a man who was carrying more than he had expected to carry. "People always talk," Orla said. "It does not require my participation." Josiah's jaw tightened. "Pa didn't leave you this land so you could crawl into it like a fox. Pa didn't leave me this land at all if you listen to you and Ephraim. He left me a piece of paper that says I own the rock. What I do with the rock is my concern." Josiah looked at her. It was a long look. It was not a kind look, but it was different from the look he had given her in the parlor on the day of the will. That look had been contempt. This look was something else. It was the look of a man who was trying to read a text he had not bothered to read before, and who was beginning to suspect that the text was not the one he had assumed. Josiah's eyes moved for the briefest moment to the crack in the rock, to the thin plume of warm air that rose steadily from it in the February cold, visible against the dark of the cedar scrub behind it like the breath of a sleeping animal. Then his eyes moved back to Orla. "You've changed," Josiah said. "I found something worth changing for." Josiah did not ask what she had found. He wanted to. Orla could see the question moving in him. But Josiah Thorne was a man who had spent 46 years being right about his sister, and to ask what was in the cave would have been to admit that he might not have been right about something, and Josiah was not a man who knew how to make such an admission. He turned the roan. He touched his heel to its flank. He rode back down the slope the way he had come, and the hoofbeats faded into the valley, and Orla stood beside her stack of kindling in the cold February morning, with the breath of the cave rising warm behind her, and she thought for a long moment about the look her brother had given the crack. Then she picked up the axe. She split another stick. Spring came to the ridge. It came slowly, the way spring comes to the Kentucky hills, in inches rather than feet. The cedars held their green through the last snows. The oaks on the lower slopes began to push tight red buds at the tips of their branches. The creek in the valley ran loud with meltwater, and a thin fuzz of new grass appeared in the sheltered hollows. At the mouth of the crack, where the warm breath of the cave met the cooling surface air, a little microclimate had developed over the winter. Ferns grew there, mosses, a few small pale plants that Orla could not name that thrived in the constant humidity of the passage's exhalation and in the low light of the sheltered overhang. She noticed them one morning in April when she came out to wash her face in the cold runoff from a spring farther up the ridge. She knelt by the crack and looked at the ferns. She had seen ferns all her life, but these were unusual. Their leaves were smaller than any maidenhair she had ever seen, and the green was paler, almost silvery. she ran a fingertip along a frond. It was soft as the hair of a cat. She wrote them down in her notebook. She did not know then that those ferns would one day bring another woman to her door. She was still in April of 1849, a woman living alone in a hole. The stranger came on a Tuesday afternoon. He came up the ridge on foot, not on horseback, because the horse was a kind of animal that did not easily climb limestone. And he led behind him a mule loaded with wooden cases of surveying equipment. He was tall. He was angular. He had a shock of white hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he had more urgent things to think about than his hair. He was somewhere past 60, Orla guessed, though his movements had the brightness of a much younger man, the brightness of a person who has spent his life asking questions and has not yet run out. Behind him came a boy of perhaps 20, bent under a leather satchel and breathing hard. The student. Orla learned his name later and then forgot it, which perhaps was not fair, but the boy was not the one who would matter to the story of Bone Ridge. The tall man was. "Miss Thorne," he called out while he was still 20 paces from the crack. Orla stood up from her work. She had been weaving a small hemp mat to hang across the entrance to her sleeping alcove. She set the unfinished mat on the flat stone. "Yes, my name is Bartholomew Hale. I'm a professor of natural science at Transylvania University in Lexington." The man had arrived at the crack now. He stopped, and his eyes went immediately to the fissure, and he looked at it with the intensity of a person who had been looking at cracks in rock for 30 years and had learned to tell at a glance which ones were worth more than a passing look. "I am told," he said, "that you have found a cave." He did not hesitate on the miss. He did not soften his question with the condescension Orla was accustomed to hearing in the voices of educated men. He asked as he would have asked a male colleague. Orla looked at him for a long moment. She had expected eventually that someone would come. She had not expected it so soon. And she had not expected a man like this. The men in the settlement had come already, a few of them curious enough to ride up and see for themselves the crack that Zebulon Crowder had described. And they had stood in the cold wind and looked at the fissure and concluded, most of them, that Crowder had exaggerated and that the Thorne girl was merely living in a rock shelter of some modest kind. They had not asked to see inside. It would not have occurred to them to ask. A woman's cave, like a woman's mind, was not considered a territory worth surveying. This man was different. "I have," Orla said. "How large?" "The main chamber is 92 feet long by 78 wide. The ceiling is 44 feet at the highest point. There are at least 12 chambers beyond it." Hale's white eyebrows went up. "You have measured?" "As best I can, by pacing, by compass. I have records." "May I see them?" "The records or the cave?" "Both," Hale said, "if you will permit it." Orla looked at him. She looked at the student. She looked at the mule with its wooden cases of what appeared to be proper surveying equipment, a surveyor's chain, a clinometer, a set of fine brass instruments in a fitted case. The tools of a man who measured the earth for a living and did it with more precision than a farmer's daughter with a compass in her pocket and her own 2 feet. "You would have to go in sideways," Orla said. "The passage is 20 inches at the narrowest point." "I have done narrower," Hale said. He had not, of course. Orla could see that he had not. Hale was taller than Orla and broader in the shoulders, and the crack was going to be harder for him than it had been for Orla on her first attempt. But the professor's eyes were bright with a kind of hunger that Orla recognized because she had felt it herself in November, kneeling before the breathing crack for the first time. It was the hunger of a person who had just realized that something on the other side of the stone might be worth very nearly anything to see. Orla said, "I will get an extra lantern." They spent 4 days in the cave. Hale negotiated the crack with a determination that bordered on the religious. He went through it sideways with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and he emerged into the cathedral chamber with limestone dust in his white hair and a bleeding scrape across his knuckles, and an expression on his face that Orla would remember for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who had opened a door he had expected to open and had instead fallen into a cathedral. Hale stood in the small circle of their combined lantern light for a long moment and did not speak. His breath came fast. He reached out slowly and laid a palm against the base of a stalagmite near where they stood, and he closed his eyes as if by touching the stone he could verify that it was real. Then he opened his eyes. "My God," he said very quietly. "Yes," Orla said. That was all they said for a while. Then Hale began to work. He worked with the discipline of a man who had spent 3 decades classifying the wonders of the earth and had developed a set of habits for converting astonishment into data. He measured the cathedral chamber with the surveyor's chain and the clinometer, and he confirmed to within a foot every one of Orla's estimates. He cataloged the formations with a systematic precision that made Orla's own notebook look, Orla thought without quite meaning to, like the rough draft of a book Hale was already writing. He tested the water of the pool in the second chamber and pronounced it pure, filtered by percolation through the limestone low in minerals, drinkable without treatment. He measured the temperature at 12 points throughout the system and found, as Orla had found, that it held steady between 55 and 58 degrees, regardless of depth or distance from the entrance. And he read the notebooks. He read them in the evening, sitting on a folded coat on the cave floor by the base of the flowstone curtain, with his own lantern set on a flat-topped stalagmite and Orla's small library of books arranged on a stone ledge behind him. He turned the pages slowly. He did not skim. He read. And when he finished the second volume late on the third night, he looked up at Orla with an expression that was not any longer the expression of a professor examining the work of an amateur. It was the expression of one careful observer regarding another. "These are good," Hale said. "Thank you. They are more than good. They are in places better than the work I have seen from trained men. Your hydrology, your formation taxonomy, the care you have taken with the air movement, the barometric notes. Where did you study?" "I did not." "You did not." "I read Lyle," Orla said. "I read Silliman's journal. There is a minister in the settlement who keeps a lending library. He let me use it when I was a girl." Hale was quiet for a moment. "Lyle and a minister's lending library," he said. "Yes." Hale set the notebook down on his knee. "Miss Thorne," he said, "I have been coming up into these hills for 20 years. I have seen a good many caves in Kentucky and in Virginia and in the caverns of the Shenandoah. I have read, I believe, every significant cave survey written in this country in the last 30 years. He paused. The lantern light moved across the flowstone curtain above them, and the amber glow of the stone seemed to deepen as he spoke. "What you have found here," he said, "is among the most significant cave systems I have ever encountered. The formations in the soda straw gallery are worth a scientific paper on their own. The helictite cluster is of museum quality, and this chamber," he gestured up at the vast dark above them, "is extraordinary. The scale, the preservation, the variety of formations in a single room. I do not exaggerate when I say that this is a site of genuine scientific importance." Orla did not know what to say to that. She had known in some quiet corner of herself since the first afternoon. She had known when she raised the lantern, and the light had dissolved into the dark, and the echo of her voice had come back to her 3 times from directions she could not fix. But to hear it said plainly by a man whose job it was to know such things was different from knowing it herself. "There is also," Hale said, "a practical matter. A practical matter. Cave tourism is becoming a significant industry in this state. Mammoth Cave has been receiving paying visitors for 30 years. There are operations at Diamond Cave, at Saltpeter Cave, at a dozen sites across Kentucky. People will pay good money to see a place like this. Not all of them will be people of science, but some of them will be, and all of them will leave having seen something they will remember for the rest of their lives." Orla looked up at the great flowstone curtain. The lantern light burned soft and patient on its amber folds. "I do not want to damage the formations," she said. "Nor should you. The best operations are the careful ones. Guided tours, controlled access, preservation as a priority. The cave's value, Miss Thorne, increases the more intact it remains. Hale leaned forward. I can help you. I can bring this to the attention of the scientific community. I can connect you with men who understand both the science and the business. But he said you will need another entrance. That crack will not serve, not for visitors, and widening it much further would damage the structural integrity of the ridge above. I know, Orla said. Oh, she had been thinking about it for weeks. She had identified during her explorations a second potential access, a sinkhole on the ridge top 30 feet east of the crack that connected to the cathedral chamber through a vertical shaft. The shaft was natural, a chimney in the limestone roughly 4 feet in diameter, dropping 25 feet to the chamber floor. It was plugged at the surface by a plug of soil and fallen debris that had accumulated over centuries, but when she had cleared away the top layer, she had felt the draft rising through it. She could open it, she could build a ladder down it, she could make a door through which a visitor, a scientist, a paying customer could descend without turning sideways. It would take work. It would take the kind of work that killed careless people. She began the digging at the start of June. She dug alone because she had nobody to help her, and because she had reached by then the kind of settled independence that made help feel more like interference. She lowered herself into the shaft on a rope tied off to a cedar stump on the ridgetop. She hauled out the loose debris in a leather bucket. She chipped at the packed soil with a short hand pick. She worked the first 10 feet in a week, and then the next 10 feet in 2, and then the last 5 feet took her the better part of a month because at 5 feet above the chamber floor, the shaft widened slightly, and the walls were loose, and every blow of the pick threatened to bring down a slide of rotten limestone onto her head. Twice a rock fell past her that would have killed her if it had not fallen past. The first time was a chunk of limestone the size of a man's head. It came loose from the wall above her without warning while she was chipping at the floor of the shaft, and it whistled past her left ear and struck the stone near her boots hard enough to send up a white burst of dust. She stood very still for a long time after that. She climbed out of the shaft. She sat on the cedar stump in the June heat. Her hands were shaking. She thought for the first time since November about her brothers. She thought about what Josiah would have said if the stone had struck, and Orla had died down there, and they had found her days later at the bottom of a shaft on a ridge that nobody had ever wanted. She thought Josiah would have said, well, the runt got what she was always going to get. She climbed back down into the shaft and kept digging. The second time was worse. It was the middle of July. She had almost broken through. The last of the earthen plug was thin, and she could feel the air of the cathedral chamber rising through the cracks around her boots, warm and clean. She was working by lantern light in the shaft, and the lantern was set on a small ledge she had chipped into the wall above her head. She struck downward with the pick, and the pick went through, and the last of the soil plug gave way beneath her. Orla dropped. She dropped 5 feet. She landed on stone. Her left ankle twisted under her. Above her, from the lip of the shaft where she had been working, a section of loose wall broke free, dislodged by the vibration of the breakthrough. It came down in pieces, small pieces mostly. Gravel, fist-sized chunks. One larger rock, perhaps 20 pounds, that struck her shoulder as she tried to roll away and drove her flat on her face against the cathedral floor. The lantern up in the shaft toppled off its ledge and shattered on the stone beside her. The flame went out. The dark that came was absolute. Orla lay on her face in the dust, in the broken limestone, and she did not move because she was not sure yet whether she was alive. Then the pain in her ankle came up her leg, and she understood that she was. She did not know how long she lay there. It could have been 5 minutes. It could have been an hour. The dark of the cave pressed down on her the way the ceiling of a closed coffin might press down. Her own breath, loud in her ears, was the only sound except for the faint, impatient drip from the pool chamber far behind her. She reached out with her right hand and felt stone. She reached out with her left and felt stone. She could not see her own hand in front of her face. She dragged herself slowly toward the direction she thought the alcove lay. Her left ankle would not bear weight. Her right shoulder was numb, and when she touched it, her fingers came away wet. She did not know how badly she was hurt. She thought very clearly and very calmly that she might die down here. Nobody knew she was in the shaft. Zebulon Crowder had not been back since January. Her brothers did not come up the ridge. Hale had gone back to Lexington. There was no reason for anyone to check on her. She could lie in the dark for days. She could lie in the dark until her food in the alcove ran out, and then she could lie in the dark for a week longer, and then she could lie in the dark forever. She found the base of the flowstone curtain by touch. She leaned against it. She closed her eyes, though it made no difference. She listened to the drip. It had been falling, she knew, for tens of thousands of years. It would fall for tens of thousands of years more. The cave did not know her. The cave did not care. But the cave was warm, and the stone at her back was the stone of the formation she had first seen glowing amber in her lantern light on a November afternoon. And in the dark, she found that she was not as afraid as she had thought she would be. She thought about her mother. She thought about the words she had written in the margin. Wait. She waited. She had been in the dark for what she later estimated was about 50 hours when she heard the voice. It came from very far away at first, from the mouth of the shaft above, a man's voice calling her name. Orla! She did not answer right away. She was not sure she was not dreaming it. Orla! You down there! It was her brother's voice. It was not Josiah's voice. It was not Ephraim's voice. It was the third brother's voice, the quiet one, the one who had said nothing in the parlor on the day of the will. And the surprise of hearing it in the dark of the cave was so complete that for a moment Orla could not make a sound. Then she called back. She called back that she was alive. She called back that her ankle was broken. She called back that her lantern had gone out. And 30 minutes later, Elias Thorne came down the shaft on a rope he had tied to his own saddle horse, a second lantern in his hand, and he knelt beside his sister in the dust of the cathedral chamber. And he looked at her for a long moment, and he said very simply, "Easy now." It was the gentlest thing any of the brothers had ever said to Orla in her life. Elias bandaged the ankle with strips from his own shirt. He cleaned the shoulder. He held a cup of cold pool water to her mouth. He said very little. He had always said very little. But he stayed for 2 days in the cave, sleeping on the floor beside Orla's platform. And in those 2 days, he looked at the cathedral chamber and the flowstone curtain and the forest of stalactites above them. And he did not speak because Elias Thorne was a man for whom speaking had always been a kind of pain. On the morning of the third day, when Orla could stand on the ankle with a cedar stick for a crutch, Elias rose to leave. He stood at the base of the ladder that Orla had not yet built, at the bottom of the shaft that was not yet finished, and he looked up at the circle of daylight far above him. And he said the thing he had come to say. Pa knew. Orla looked at him. Knew what? That there was something here. Elias did not look at her. Elias was looking at the flowstone curtain. His face in the amber light was the face of a man who had carried a thing for a long time and was finally setting it down. Pa used to walk this ridge by himself, he said. After Ma died, in the evening sometimes. He would be gone 3-4 hours. He never said where he went, but I saw him come down once when I was maybe 15, and his coat had dust on it like he had been in a dry place. White dust, limestone dust. He was quiet for a moment. I did not know what it meant. Boy that age does not know what anything means, but I remember it. Orla did not move. He never told me, Orla said. No, he never told any of you. No, he would not have. Pa was not a telling kind of man. Elias's jaw worked. But when the will got read and you got the ridge and Josiah and Eve were laughing, I remembered the dust. I remembered the evenings. And I thought maybe Pa knew. Maybe he was leaving you the thing you were the only one who would find. He looked at her now. His eyes were wet. I should have said it in the parlor, he said. I should have said something. I stood there and I let them laugh and I let you walk out. And I have been thinking on that for 8 months, Orla, and I have not slept right for 6 of them. You hear me? Orla could not speak. Elias reached out. He put a hand on his sister's shoulder and on the side that was not bruised, and he held it there for a long moment in the warm, still air of the cave her father had known about and had never named. Then he took his hand away. He climbed the rope back up the shaft. Orla heard the horse above and the creak of the saddle and the hoofbeats fading down the ridge. She sat alone in the cathedral chamber with the lantern burning and the flowstone curtain glowing amber behind her. And for the first time since the summer of 1820, when she was 9 years old, Orla Thorne cried for her father. She cried for a long time. The cave did not mind. The cave did not know. The drip in the pool chamber kept its patient rhythm, and the air moved gently through the passages, and the amber stone glowed in the lantern light. And Orla Thorne, 37 years old, wept in the deep earth for a man who had walked a ridge alone for 30 years and had left at the end of it a line in a will that nobody else had bothered to understand. Together with whatever may be found thereon, her father had known. Her father had left her the one thing he had not known how to give her in any other way. She finished the shaft in August. She built the ladder in September. She built it out of black locust, the hardest and most rot-resistant wood in the Kentucky hills, and she cut the round rungs on a lathe that she had borrowed from the wheelwright in the settlement, and she secured them in mortised holes in the side rails with wedged oak pegs. It descended the full 25 feet of the shaft. It landed on the cathedral floor 10 paces from the base of the flowstone curtain. The climb was not easy, but it was possible for any reasonably able-bodied person, and it eliminated the crack as the primary access to the cave, and it opened the cathedral chamber to visitors who would never have fit through 18 inches of limestone. Bartholomew Hale came back in the middle of September. He came with 2 colleagues from Transylvania University and with a journalist from the Lexington Observer, a thin, sharp-eyed man named Thaddeus Pike, who had written a book about Mammoth Cave and considered himself a difficult man to impress. They descended the ladder into the cathedral chamber by lantern light, and when Pike reached the floor and raised his lantern and turned slowly in the amber glow of the great flowstone curtain, he did not speak for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said only, "Good God." He said nothing else for several minutes. Then he asked Orla how long the formations had taken to grow. "Tens of thousands of years," Orla said. "Perhaps 100,000 for the largest columns. A stalactite grows about an inch per century under ideal conditions." Pike looked up at a stalactite that hung like a spear 6 feet above his head. 600 years, he said. "At minimum, probably longer. The growth rate varies with the water chemistry and the temperature." "And it has been here all this time," Pike said, "behind a crack in a rock." "Behind a crack in a rock," Orla said. Pike's article ran in the Observer in the first week of October. It was not long, but it was written by a man who had stood in the cathedral chamber and could not forget what he had seen, and the prose carried the weight of that unforgetting. Pike did not mention that the person who had found the cave and mapped it and was now guiding visitors through it was a woman. That omission was not his oversight. Hale had asked him to leave it out, and Pike had agreed, and both men had made the calculation without needing to discuss it, that a cave discovered by a woman in 1849 would not be taken as seriously by the scientific public as a cave discovered by a man. When Orla read the article, she understood the omission, and she did not object. She had not, she realized, been written out of her own discovery. She had been written around it. That was a different thing. The cave was still hers. The notebooks were still hers. The readers would come and they would see and they would know. Within 10 days, the first letters began to arrive at the post office in the settlement, addressed to Mr. Othorne, Bone Ridge, Harlan County, Kentucky. The postmaster did not correct the Mr. He had already decided privately that he did not want to. The first visitor came 2 weeks later. He was a doctor from Lexington traveling with his wife and grown daughter, and he had read the article in the Observer and had decided on a Sunday afternoon that he wanted to see the cave for himself. Orla met them at the shaft entrance. She had built by then a small roofed shelter over the shaft head, a kind of well housing with a cedar door that she could padlock. She had built a wooden bench for visitors to sit on while they waited. She had built inside the cave a handrail along the section of passage between the cathedral chamber and the pool chamber to keep clumsy feet away from the more delicate formations. The doctor looked at her for a beat too long when he realized she was the guide. His wife looked once and then looked away, already settling the matter. His daughter, who was perhaps 20, looked at Orla as if she had never seen a woman like her before. Orla charged the family 75 cents, 25 cents each. She led them through the cave for 2 hours by the light of 3 lanterns. She told them what she knew, which was a great deal in a quiet, steady voice. She did not perform. She did not embellish. She told them about Lyell. She told them about the slow patience of water. She told them about the drip in the pool chamber, which had been falling since before the pharaohs. She told them about the soda straw gallery, where they would have to move slowly and breathe softly because the formations were thinner than a reed and older than the idea of a country. The doctor's daughter stood in the cathedral chamber and wept silently for a full minute. The doctor shook Orla's hand at the top of the shaft and said that he had never in all his life seen such a thing. He said it as a man says a thing he has decided is true, regardless of whom it cost him to admit. They went back to Lexington. They told their friends. By the end of November, Orla had guided 11 tours. By the end of December, she had guided 19. The income was modest but steady. $5 in a good week, 3 in a lean one, more money than she had ever earned in her life. She saved it in a tin box in the alcove beside her bed platform. She bought better lanterns. She bought a second lock for the shaft door. She bought supplies for the winter salt pork flour, coffee-dried apples, and pushed them through the crack rather than down the ladder. Because the ladder she preferred to reserve for visitors, and the crack was still to her the real entrance to the place. The entrance her brothers could not fit through the entrance that her father had perhaps once long ago, in a widower's walk on a summer evening, leaned his face against and felt the breath of the earth on his cheek. In the middle of that December, a letter came from Bartholomew Hale. It was a short letter, 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph congratulated Orla on the growing reputation of the cave. The second paragraph mentioned in passing that Hale had a young friend, an artist of some promise, a woman of careful habits and unusual eye, who had expressed interest in coming to Bone Ridge in the spring to sketch the ferns at the mouth of the crack. Her name, Hale wrote, was Rowan Bellamy. Her father had been a school teacher in Lexington. He had died the previous year, and she had a small inheritance and few family obligations, and she drew plants the way good men drew maps. She worked in graphite and watercolor. She was, Hale said, the finest botanical illustrator he had ever met outside the Eastern universities. Would Orla permit her to visit? Orla read the letter twice by lantern light, sitting at her small desk in the alcove by the flowstone curtain, with the amber glow of the great formation lighting the page. She thought about the ferns at the mouth of the crack. She thought about the small, unnamed plants growing in the sheltered overhang, where the warm breath of the cave met the cold air of the outside world. She thought about how she had noticed them in the April morning, and how she had written them in her notebook, and how she had never quite known what to do with the notation, because she was not a botanist, and because no one had ever asked. She picked up her pen. She wrote back in a careful hand that Miss Bellamy would be most welcome at Bone Ridge in the spring. She sealed the letter. She set it in the tin box with the money. She blew out the lantern. She lay down on her platform in the absolute dark, and she listened to the drip, and she thought about the word her mother had written in the margin of the Bible. Wait. She smiled in the dark for the first time in a long time. She had waited. Rowan Bellamy came up the ridge in the first week of June. It was a warm morning, the kind of warm that Kentucky only gives out in the last days before the heat turns heavy, and the air on Bone Ridge still had the cedar green smell of spring in it. Orla had been expecting her for 3 weeks. She had swept the shelter over the shaft. She had laid a fresh cedar plank across the 2 stumps that served as a bench. She had, without quite meaning to, washed her hair in the Cold Spring runoff that morning. She did not see Rowan coming at first. She was kneeling at the mouth of the crack, trimming a dead frond off one of the small, pale ferns she had been watching all spring when she heard the scrape of a boot on limestone above her and looked up. A woman was standing there. She was tall. She was taller than Orla, though not by much. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck. A plain brown traveling dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. A canvas satchel on her shoulder. A magnifying glass on a cord around her neck hanging against her sternum like a pendant. And her hands, Orla noticed her hands were stained at the fingertips with ink in a way she had not bothered to scrub off before the journey. A working woman's hands. Hands that did not care what the rest of the world thought about ink stains. She was 29 years old. Orla learned that later. She looked down at Orla kneeling in the dust by the crack with the shears in her hand and the fern frond between her fingers, and she smiled. It was not a small smile. "Miss Thorne," she said, "I do apologize for coming up alone. The boy at the inn wanted to guide me, but I thought he would only talk the whole way." Orla stood up. She set the shears on the flat stone. She wiped her hands on her skirt. "Miss Bellamy?" "Rowan," she said. "I do not answer to Miss Bellamy well." It was what the schoolmaster called the girls who had not done their lessons. "Rowan, then. And may I call you Orla?" "Please." Rowan said the name slowly as if trying it out, and then she nodded once as if the name had passed some test. Her eyes moved past Orla to the crack in the rock, and then down to the pale silvery ferns, and then down further to the little wet dark overhang, where the warm breath of the cave met the June air, and where the mosses grew in a green carpet that no garden in Lexington could have grown. Her face changed. It changed the way Orla's own face had changed, Orla realized later, on a November afternoon 7 months earlier, when she had first raised her lantern in the cathedral chamber, and the light had dissolved into the dark. She knelt in the dust beside Orla. She did not speak for a long time. She pulled the magnifying glass up from her chest and held it over one of the pale ferns, and she looked, and when she finally sat back on her heels, her eyes were bright in a way Orla had never seen another person's eyes be bright. "Orla," she said, still looking at the fern, "do you know what this is? A fern." "I do not know what this is." Orla looked at her. "I have been drawing ferns for 11 years, Rowan said. "I have drawn every fern in the eastern states that has been named in a proper botanical register. I studied under Professor Hale's predecessor at Transylvania before he retired unofficially, as a woman must, and I can tell you the Latin name of every fern growing between the Ohio and the Cumberland. And this is not a fern I have ever seen." She looked up. "This might not have a name." Orla looked at the small, silvery plant between them. It had been growing here, she thought, for as long as the crack had been breathing. Nobody had ever seen it except her. Nobody had even known to look. "Then you should name it," she said. Rowan Bellamy laughed. It was a surprised, bright laugh and not a polite one. It was the laugh of a woman who had not expected to be spoken to the way an equal speaks to an equal on her first morning in a strange place. "That is not how it is done, Miss Thorne." "Orla." "That is not how it is done, Orla. It has to be described, drawn, submitted, a specimen pressed and preserved. It has to be compared against every known species. You cannot just name a thing." "Why not?" She looked at Orla for a long moment. "Because no woman ever has," she said. "Then it is time one did." Rowan did not answer that. She only looked at Orla, and her expression was the expression of a person who has just met a stranger and has begun, for reasons she cannot quite name, to suspect that the stranger is not a stranger at all. She stayed 6 days. She drew the ferns. She drew the mosses. She drew the liverwort. The small creeping thing that she said after the third morning of careful study, with her magnifying glass, appeared to be an entirely undescribed species, a new thing in the registers of the known world, growing in the shelter of a crack on a ridge that nobody had bothered to climb. She sat cross-legged on the limestone with her drawing board on her knees, and her pencil moved over the paper with the speed and certainty of a woman who had trained her hand for a decade to do exactly what her eye told it to do. Orla watched her sometimes quietly from a little distance because she had never watched anyone work the way she worked. She had seen her father work. Her father had worked with his whole back, with the weight of his body, with the bluntness of a man who measured his life in bushels. Rowan worked with her eyes. She worked the way Orla herself had learned to work. Orla realized on the second day bent over her own notebook in the cave. She saw things. She saw past the surface of a thing to the structure of it. She drew the way Orla wrote, with patience, with reverence, with the conviction that a thing observed long enough would eventually tell you what it was. On the second evening, they sat outside the cabin Orla had built on the ridgetop earlier that spring. A small square thing, 3 walls and a roof open on the east side toward the shaft entrance, a staging cabin more than a dwelling. The sun was going down over the Cumberlands. The light on the ridge was the color of old honey. Rowan said, "You see things." Orla looked at her. "Everyone sees things," she said. "Everyone looks. Not everyone sees." Rowan turned her head toward her. Her eyes in the evening light were the color of the pool in the second chamber, dark and clear and deep. "You sound like my father." Was he a seeing man? He used to say that seeing was the hardest work there is, harder than digging, harder than building. Because when you really see something, you have to accept what is there, not what you expected to find. "Your father sounds like a man I would have liked to know." "You would have. He was a school teacher. He died a year ago last March. I miss him every day." There was a silence between them, not an uncomfortable one. Orla thought about her own father. She thought about the dust Elias had described, the white limestone dust on Amos Thorne's coat on an evening 30 years ago. She thought about the line in the will. "What did you expect here," she said, "when you came up the ridge?" Rowan thought about it. "Ferns," she said. She smiled a small, private smile. "I found a new species," she said, "in a cave I can feel in the air from 100 yards away, and a woman who lives inside a mountain and talks to me as if I am a colleague instead of a curiosity." She turned to look at Orla full on. "I would say reality has exceeded expectations." Orla did not trust her voice for a moment. "That is a good line," she said when she did. "Keep it. It is yours. I have no use for lines. I only draw pictures." Rowan came back in July. She came back in August and stayed 10 days. By October, the shape of the arrangement had become clear to both of them without ever needing to be discussed. Rowan had few ties in Lexington, a small rented room, a landlady who tolerated her, a handful of acquaintances at the university who used her talents and paid her modestly. She had no family left. Her work did not require a city, only a subject. And the subject she had found at Bone Ridge was larger than anything Lexington had offered her in a decade. In the first week of November 1851 year, to the day after Orla had first moved into the cave, Rowan Bellamy arrived on the ridge with a cedar trunk of clothes, a cedar trunk of books, a crate of drawing supplies, and the quiet, settled air of a woman who had decided something. "If you will have me," she said at the shaft entrance, "I mean to stay." Orla did not answer for a moment. Her throat had closed in a way she did not expect. "I will have you," she said. "Of course I will." They did not marry. 2 women in Harlan County in 1850 did not marry one another, and neither of them wanted the kind of ceremony that would have required lies. But in the settlement, and later in Lexington, and in the pages of scientific correspondence, they came to be known as the Thorne-Bellamy household, a phrase that the postmaster used on envelopes and that the minister Whitcomb used when he wrote to them, and that the University of Transylvania eventually used when it printed in 1863 the first monograph on the cave system, co-credited to O. Thorne and R. Bellamy. 2 women sharing a home and a body of work and a life was a thing the 19th century knew how to hold without entirely naming it, and Orla and Rowan lived inside that unnamed thing for 38 years. Rowan moved into the cave with Orla. Not the cabin on the ridgetop, which she considered merely a convenient staging area. The cave itself, the cathedral chamber where Orla Bella had been living for 2 years. She brought her drawing board and her books and her magnifying glass in a small cedar trunk of clothes, and within a month she had transformed Orla's solitary arrangement of bedroll and scattered notebooks into a home. She hung a length of plain cotton across the entrance to the alcove to make a private sleeping chamber. She arranged the cooking area near the passage with the efficiency of a woman who had kept house for her schoolteacher father for a decade after her mother's death. She installed a system of hooks and shelves for drying herbs and storing provisions that used the natural irregularities of the limestone walls so cleverly that visitors in later years would assume the ledges had been carved for the purpose. And she drew. She drew the cave. She drew the flow stone curtain, the great amber glowing wall of stone that she set on her first descent into the cathedral had made her sit down on the nearest stalagmite and fail to speak for 10 minutes. She drew the soda straw gallery by the light of the two lanterns set on the floor, working in graphite with the magnifying glass between her teeth, when she needed both hands capturing the fragile crystalline forest, in a way that no one Bartholomew Hale would later say had ever captured stone. She drew the rimstone dams. She drew the pool in the second chamber, with the drip showing in her composition as a single fine line above the still water, and the still water showing the inverted reflection of the stalactites above. She drew, and the drawings began to go out over the following years to scientific journals and private collectors and museums, and the drawings began to build around the cave a reputation that no written description could have built. People could read about the cathedral chamber and nod. They could look at one of Rowan's drawings of the cathedral chamber and put the page down and be unable for a long moment to say anything at all. The years passed. The tours grew. By 1855, Orla was guiding 200 visitors a year. The income supplemented by the sale of Rowan's illustrations to scientific publications and private collectors allowed them to live comfortably. They enlarged the cabin on the ridgetop into a proper house for winter storage and for visitors who needed a place to wait. They improved the shaft entrance with a stone collar and a real roofed shelter. They hired a young man from the settlement, a polite, quiet boy named Amos Crowder, who was Zebulon's nephew, to help with the tours during the busy season and to manage the growing correspondence. But they kept sleeping in the cave. The cathedral chamber, with the amber glow of the great flowstone curtain, was home in a way no house could ever be. Ephraim died in the winter of 1862. A log broke free at the sawmill. It rolled down the ramp. It struck him across the chest and drove him into the wall, and he died in the sawdust with a look of mild surprise on his face, as if he had been about to say something, and the log had arrived before the words. He was 57. The mill had been the pride of his life, the thing he had always held over his younger brothers and his only sister, the proof of his position in the family. And the mill had killed him. His wife, a plain, kind woman named Bethany, whom he had married too late, was left with two small children, Amos, who was 4, Mara, who was 2. Bethany was not a strong woman. She had taken Ephraim's death hard, and the farm he had built was less prosperous than he had pretended, and within 18 months she too was dead of a wasting sickness that the doctor in the settlement called consumption and could not treat. The children came up the ridge in May of 1864. Elias brought them in his wagon. Josiah would not have them. Josiah's own wife had refused, and Josiah had agreed, though his face had been dark about it for weeks. Elias had agreed to take them himself, but Elias was a bachelor in his late 50s now, with no house suited to children, and his own health was uncertain. He brought them up the ridge because Orla and Rowan were the only Thorns left who had a house large enough for children and 2 adults with the patience to raise them. Orla met the wagon at the head of the ridge road. Amos, 6 years old by then, stood in the wagon bed holding his little sister's hand. Mara, 4, had her face pressed against his coat. Neither of them spoke. Orla looked at them for a long moment. She looked at Rowan, who had come out of the cabin behind her. Rowan, who had no children of her own and had never expected any, nodded once. Orla turned back to her nephew and niece. She knelt down in the dust of the ridge road until her eyes were level with theirs. Amos, she said, Mara, my name is your Aunt Orla. This is Rowan. You are going to live with us now. Would that be all right? Amos looked at her for a long, solemn moment. Is it a real cave? He said. It is. Pa said caves was for bats. There are no bats in this one. There is a room with a wall of stone that glows in the lantern light. There is a pool of water you can see to the bottom of. There are formations so thin you can break them with a breath so we do not breathe on them. Amos considered this. All right, he said. Mara did not say anything, but she let go of her brother's hand and she held out her arms to Orla, and Orla picked her up, and the girl's small body was hot and trembling and smelled of travel and sickness and unwashed hair, and Orla carried her down into the cabin without another word. That night, for the first time since 1848, Orla Thorne did not sleep in the cathedral chamber. She slept in the cabin on the ridge top in a bed she had built quickly that afternoon from cedar planks, with the little girl curled in the crook of her arm and the boy asleep on a pallet at their feet. Rowan sat up by the fire and watched over them. Neither of the women had slept much the night before, or the night after, or for weeks to come, but neither of them would have chosen otherwise. The war reached Bone Ridge that winter. Kentucky's divided loyalties meant that both armies moved through the hills at different times, and it was never easy to say in the middle of a rumor whether the next men riding up the Creek Valley would be Federal or Confederate or neither. Orla was 53 years old by then. She kept guiding the few visitors who still came up to Bone Ridge, but for no fee. It seemed wrong to her to charge money for beauty while young men were dying in fields not 50 miles away. A Confederate foraging party climbed partway up the ridge in the autumn of 1862, drawn by the smoke from the cabin chimney, and demanded food. Orla gave them what she had: a sack of cornmeal, a jar of honey Rowan had taken from wild bees in the summer, a strip of dried venison. The soldiers were young, thin, and tired, and they took the food without violence and left without discovering the cave entrance, which was hidden by the well house over the shaft. Rowan watched them go from the cabin window with her arms around both children. When they had faded down the slope, Rowan said very quietly, without looking away from the window, "We should keep less food in the cabin and more in the cave." It was a practical observation. Orla followed it. They moved the stores underground that week. 56 degrees was a better larder than any cabin that froze in winter and sweltered in summer. By the end of October, 200 pounds of salt pork, meal flour, dried apples, smoked fish, and lamp oil sat in the cool of the cathedral chamber. In the winter of 1864, a larger party came. Not uniformed soldiers this time. A detachment of irregulars, 11 of them, riding up from the south, drawn by rumor that the Thorne farm in the valley had once been prosperous. They burned the farmhouse Josiah had inherited. They stripped the barn. They scattered the livestock. And then, still not satisfied, they rode on up the creek and climbed the ridge because a rumor had reached them that a strange household lived in the hills, 2 women and 2 children, and strange households sometimes had things worth taking. Rowan had seen them coming from the ridge top an hour earlier. She had taken Amos and Mara down the ladder into the cave. She had told Amos, who was 10 years old by then, that he was to sit beside his sister in the soda straw gallery with the lantern turned low and not say a word, no matter what he heard from above, and he was to hold his sister's hand until one of his aunts came back down. Amos Crowder had taken the ladder up after them and gone to hide in the woods with the rifle. Rowan had climbed out, closed the shaft door, and covered it with a bucket and a length of rope so that it looked like what it had always been designed to look like: an ordinary well. Then she had walked back to the cabin, where Orla was already waiting, and the 2 women had stood in the dooryard when the 11 men came out of the cedar. The men ransacked the cabin. They found it nearly empty. A small store of cornmeal intentionally left, a jug of cider on the table, a few tin cups. The cabin looked like the cabin of 2 women too poor to bother with. The leader of the irregulars, a thick-necked man with a scar across his nose, and the eyes of someone who had already killed more men than he would admit, looked at Orla for a long time. "Where's the rest, Grandma?" he said. "That is all there is. I heard some strange woman had found a cave up here." Orla looked at him. "You heard wrong." "Did I?" "You heard wrong." The thick-necked man stepped closer. He put the flat of his hand on Orla's shoulder. He shoved. Orla stumbled back against the cabin wall. Rowan took a step forward, and the man turned the pistol at his belt toward her, and Rowan stopped. I'll ask you once more, he said. Where's the rest? There is no rest, he hit her. It was a hard blow, an open-handed slap that rocked her head to the side and split her lip. Rowan made a small, controlled sound. Not a scream, not a cry, the sound of a woman who had decided that she would not give these men the satisfaction. Orla straightened. She tasted blood. She looked the thick-necked man in the eye, and she did not look away. Everything we had was in the cabin, she said. You have seen it. He hit her again. It was harder the second time. Orla went down on one knee in the dust outside the cabin. She could hear very faintly, very far below, nothing. Her niece and nephew were silent in the soda straw gallery. They were doing what they had been told to do. She set her teeth and said nothing. The man kicked her in the ribs. Orla went flat. She did not cry out. The men searched the ridge for an hour. They looked in the cabin. They looked in the woodshed. They looked at the well house over the shaft and concluded it was a well because that was what it looked like. And they did not open the door because a well was a well. They did not find the cave. They did not find the food. They did not find the children. They mounted up. The thick-necked man spat in the dust beside Orla's face. Your brothers had better land than this, he said. Shame the girls got the bones. He did not know, Orla thought as they rode away, how wrong he was. Rowan helped her up. They stood together, the two of them, in the dooryard of the cabin, and Rowan's hand shook where it touched Orla's back. And Orla's lip was split, and her ribs screamed with every breath, and her ankle ached in the cold the way it had ached since the summer of 1849. Neither of them spoke. The ridge was silent again. The men had gone. Rowan helped her down the ladder into the cave. Amos and Mara came running out of the soda straw gallery when they saw the lantern, and Amos stopped when he saw his aunt's face, and Mara did not stop, and she ran into Orla's side and held on and did not let go for a very long time. Orla stroked the girl's hair with her free hand. We are all right, she said. We are all right. We are all right. In the cathedral chamber that evening, under the amber glow of the great flowstone curtain, with the two children eating a cold supper at the small table Rowan had set out, Rowan leaned against Orla's shoulder and did not speak for a long time. Then she said very quietly, the cave saved them. Yes. The cave you were given as a joke. Yes. Rowan closed her eyes. Your father knew what he was doing. He did. That was all they said about it that night or ever. Josiah died in January of 1867. His heart gave out while he was plowing a field he had plowed every spring for 30 years. He had been working the bottom land hard as he worked everything with force rather than understanding, with demand rather than partnership. And the soil had given back less each year, and Josiah had given more, and the exchange had never been equal. He had dropped in the furrow behind the mule. His son found him at noon. He was 54 years old. Orla did not go to the funeral. Rowan asked her if she wanted to. Rowan did not press when Orla said no. Rowan walked down to the settlement herself that afternoon with Mara in her skirts, and she paid her respects at the grave. And she sat for an hour with Josiah's widow, who had always been one of the few women in the settlement who had been quietly kind. Rowan came back up the ridge at dusk and did not speak of it, and Orla did not ask, and the matter was settled between them, the way most matters were settled between them. Elias came up the ridge one more time in the autumn of 1869. He was 60 years old by then, the only brother left above ground. He descended the ladder into the cathedral chamber. He stood in the amber light of the flowstone curtain. He looked at Orla, who was 58 years old now, gray hair pulled back, face lined but steady. It is bigger than I thought it was, he said. Yes. You have been here 21 years, Orla. Yes. Ma would have liked it. Orla had not thought about that. She had not in all the years of living in the cave ever once thought about whether her mother would have liked it. The thought arrived now with the force of a small blow. Mary Thorne, who had read to her daughter in the evenings, who had underlined a verse in Isaiah and written in the margin the word wait. She had been a woman with a quiet eye. She had been perhaps the person Orla had most taken after, and Orla had not known it until this moment. Her voice was not quite steady. I think she would have, yes. Elias nodded. He looked up at the stalactites high above. He looked at the columns where stalactite and stalagmite had joined across centuries into the complete pillars that ran from floor to ceiling. "Thank you, Orla," he said. "For what?" "For not letting the ridge die with Pa." That was all. Elias never explained the sentence. He did not have to. He climbed the ladder out of the cave and he rode down the slope to his small, neat farm, and he lived there alone for another 11 years. Orla never saw him alive again. A letter came in the spring of 1880. Elias had died in his sleep peacefully in his own bed and had been buried in the family plot beside his mother and his father. Orla read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in the tin box. She walked out to the ridge top and sat on the flat rock where she had first sat in November of 1848 with the word "wait" in her hand and nothing else in the world. She was 69 years old now. She looked out at the Cumberlands and thought about her three brothers, all in the earth now, and about her mother and father, and about how the last thorn above the ground was the daughter the runt, the one who had been given the bones. She did not feel triumphant. She felt instead held, the way the stone had held her all those years. The children grew. Amos became a serious young man who inherited his Aunt Orla's patience and his Uncle Elias's silence. By 12, he could name every formation in the cave. By 20, he took over the running of the tours, and he was a more articulate guide than his aunt had ever been, though a less intuitive one. Mara was something else. Mara was adventurous physical, drawn to the cave's unexplored margins. When she was 12 years old, Mara crawled through a passage that Orla had dismissed as a dead end, and she came out on the other side into a chamber, nearly as large as the cathedral, full of calcite formations no human eye had ever seen. Mara came back up the ladder with her hair white with limestone dust and her eyes bright. "Aunt Orla," she said, "there's a seventh big room." Orla and Rowan went down with her. They stood in the new chamber in the amber light of 3 lanterns, and Orla turned slowly, and she understood that her niece had just discovered something that Orla, in 25 years of living in the cave, had missed. Orla put her hand on Mara's shoulder. "Mara Gallery," she said. "That is what it will be called." Mara looked up at her astonished. "Mine, yours, you found it. It is named for you." Mara Thorne, at 12 years old, stood in the room that would bear her name for the next 150 years, and did not speak because there was nothing in that moment she could say. Rowan finished her 12th portfolio in 1882. The collected illustrations of Yancey's Cathedral Cave, as the scientific community had come to call the system in their correspondence, filled a dozen leather folios and represented the most complete visual record of any American cave produced in the 19th century. In the spring of 1882, a selection of her drawings was exhibited at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. A critic for the Tribune praised them. Rowan read the review by the fire in the cabin and set the newspaper down and said only, he should see the cave. She was 71 years old by then. She died on a cold morning in March of 1888. She had been ill for a week. She was 67. She had lived in the cave with Orla for 38 years. She died in the cathedral chamber on the bed platform where she and Orla had slept together under the amber glow of the flowstone curtain for nearly 4 decades with Orla's hand in hers. Her hands at the end were still stained with ink at the fingertips. She had never, not once in 38 years, scrubbed them clean. The ink was by then as much a part of her as the freckles on the back of her neck. She said, "You will be all right." "I will not." "You will, Orla. Look after Amos. Look after Mara. Look after the cave." "I will." She closed her eyes. She did not open them again. The drip in the pool chamber kept its rhythm. The amber glow of the flowstone curtain was the same as it had been on the first night Rowan had come down the ladder and sat on a stalagmite and been unable to speak for 10 minutes. The stalactites above them had witnessed her arrival as a young woman with ink-stained fingers in a magnifying glass, and they witnessed her departure with the same ancient patient indifference with which they witnessed everything. Orla sat with her until the lantern burned low. Then she blew it out. She sat with her in the absolute dark of the deep earth, and she held her hand, and she did not weep. The weeping would come later in the weeks and months ahead in unexpected places. But on the first night in the cave in the dark, she only held her hand and listened to the patience of the earth. She buried Rowan on the ridgetop in the spot where the morning sun fell first, where the maidenhair fern Rowan had come to study grew in such profusion that the rocky ground looked softened, almost gentle. She carved her name into a slab of the ridge's own limestone and set it at the head of the grave. And beneath her name, she carved the words Rowan had said on their second evening together 38 years before. Reality exceeded expectations. Orla lived for one more year. She spent it in the cave. Amos had taken over the tours entirely by then. Mara had married a geologist from Ohio who had come up to see the cave in 1884 and had failed to leave, and she lived with her husband in a small stone house on the ridge and was expecting her first child. Orla wrote in her 39th notebook. She wrote about the cave's constancy, the same temperature, the same formations, the same slow drip in the pool chamber, meandering she now calculated for something closer to 75,000 years and destined to fall for 75,000 more. She wrote on the last page about the crack in the rock. Too narrow for my brothers, she wrote, too dark for my neighbors, too strange for my father, and just wide enough for a woman who was willing to turn sideways and push through. She set the pen down. On the morning of the 6th of January, 1889, Amos came down the ladder into the cathedral chamber with breakfast on a tray and found his aunt sitting upright in her chair at the desk with the lantern still burning and the notebook open to the last page and the pen lying beside it where her hand had set it down. Amos stood for a long time. Then he set the tray carefully on a flat stalagmite. He walked to the desk. He put his hand very gently on his aunt's shoulder. The shoulder was cool. He recorded in the cave's logbook that night only what a careful man would have recorded. The time he had found her, the state of the lantern, the temperature of the cathedral chamber, which was 56 degrees as it had been every morning for 40 years. He closed her last notebook. He placed it on the shelf beside the others. 39 notebooks spanning 40 years of observation. Then he climbed the ladder out of the cave into the January cold and stood on the ridgetop and looked at the mountains which were white with snow and very still. Somewhere below him in the dark, the drip in the pool chamber kept its rhythm. The cave went on. Amos Thorne, the nephew she had raised from a frightened 6-year-old in a wagon, operated the cave until 1912. He expanded the tour route to include the Mara Gallery. His own son, a boy they named Elias, operated it until 1938 and added electric lighting in 1929, a modernization that his great-aunt would have found practical and faintly regrettable in equal measure. The 39 notebooks were donated to the library at Transylvania University in 1940, where they became a foundational resource in the study of Kentucky karst geology. The surveys were cataloged under the name O. Thorne, and it was not until the 1950s that a young archivist going through the correspondence discovered that O. Thorne had been a woman, and the catalog was corrected, and a quiet paper was published arguing for the reassessment of her work, which was already by then acknowledged as the foundation of every scientific study of the cave. Rowan's illustrations were acquired by the Smithsonian in 1955. A selection remains on permanent display. The cave was designated a National Natural Landmark in 1972. The Great Flowstone Curtain is still intact. The soda straws still hang in their crystalline forest. The pool in the second chamber still holds its clear, still water fed by a drip that has not stopped since before people walked this continent. Modern geologists have confirmed and extended Orla Thorne's observations. The cave holds its temperature between 55 and 58 degrees. The formations are calcite, aragonite, and gypsum. The hydrology follows the path she traced. A geologist at the University of Kentucky, writing in 2004, described the Thorne notebooks as among the most detailed and accurate amateur cave surveys of the 19th century, remarkable not only for their precision, but for the evident affection with which their author regarded her subject. The crack in the east face of Bone Ridge is still there. It is still 18 inches wide. Orla's careful widening to 20 inches has been slowly worn back by a century and three-quarters of weather. The crack still breathes. On cold days, you can see the exhalation, a faint plume of warmth rising from the rock, like the breath of something sleeping. Most people walk past it. It is too narrow, too dark, too much like a mouth. But the cathedral is still there on the other side, 40 feet in and a world away, exactly as it was on the 12th of November, 1848, when a 37-year-old woman who had been given nothing turned sideways and pushed through. The amber glow of the great flowstone curtain still holds its patient fire. The drip still falls. The air still moves through the passages in its long, slow, ancient breathing. The cave is waiting. It has always been waiting for the next person narrow enough and brave enough to turn sideways and find out what the darkness holds. The earth keeps its wonders in tight places. It always has. The question was never what lay beyond the crack. The question from the very beginning was who would be willing to go and see.